The story begins with our protagonist, Isabel, a bright, ambitious orphan who has always dreamed of escaping her humble beginnings. Despite her struggles, she managed to excel at university, hoping her efforts would lead her to a scholarship in Italy to study fashion design. A dream that sustained her through sleepless nights and endless part-time jobs. Isabel's eyes gleamed with hope as she opened her mailbox one morning, only to find a letter that shattered her world. Her scholarship had been revoked. Heartbroken and confused, she learned that a mistake made by the sponsoring company had dashed her dreams. The president of the company, Gabriel, was an influential but cold-hearted businessman, known for his ruthless business tactics. Isabel couldn't fathom how someone like him could hold her future in his hands, and she vowed to confront him. On the day of her graduation, as students celebrated around her, Isabel stood on the podium not with pride, but with fury. She delivered a speech that stunned the audience, publicly condemning the company president for his actions. Little did she know, Gabriel was in attendance, his steely gaze fixed on her the entire time. The encounter between Isabel and Gabriel was only the beginning of a series of unexpected events that would intertwine their fates in ways neither could foresee. Later that evening, consumed by anger, Isabel scratched Gabriel's luxury car in a fit of revenge. She thought she had gotten away with it, until he confronted her. Instead of retaliation, Gabriel made a surprising demand. He needed her help to meet a client and insisted she come along. Isabel had no idea how she ended up sitting in the passenger seat of Gabriel's sleek black car, but there she was, staring out the window in a tense silence. Her fingers still tingled from the moment when she'd taken out her frustrations on the car's glossy surface. She half expected him to yell at her, demand compensation, or worse, call the police. But instead, Gabriel had looked at her with an unreadable expression, and in a voice as smooth as the leather seats, told her she was coming with him to meet a client. "Why me?" Isabel finally asked, her voice shaky but defiant. She had nothing to lose at this point. Gabriel shifted gears, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Because you owe me. You scratched my car, and now you're going to help fix this situation." Her anger flared again. "I don't owe you anything. If anything, your company owes me for ruining my future." His lips twitched into the ghost of a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You're resourceful. That's why you were going to get that scholarship, wasn't it?" Isabel bit her lip, unwilling to let his words affect her. His casual acknowledgement of her talent stung more than any insult. Silence fell between them once more as the car sped along the winding roads until something caught Isabel's attention. As she glanced into the back seat, she saw a pair of handcuffs, the cold metal glinting ominously in the dim light. Her heart skipped a beat. "Why do you have handcuffs in your car?" Gabriel glanced at her, his face impassive. "Those, a memento from an ex." Isabel's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "An ex? You're carrying around handcuffs from an ex?" "She had strange interests," he replied with a shrug, turning back to the road. She couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. This cold, calculating man was carrying around handcuffs from a past lover? It was almost too much to take in. But her laughter faded when they hit a traffic light, and she noticed Gabriel's hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. There was something deeper to him, something he wasn't showing, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a strange sense of curiosity about who he really was beneath the surface. The light turned green, and Gabriel suddenly grimaced, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "I can't sit here anymore," he muttered. Isabel looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" I've got a back injury," he admitted reluctantly. "I can't drive for too long." Isabel blinked, the pieces falling into place. "So you want me to drive?" she asked, incredulous. Gabriel hesitated before nodding. "Yes." She wanted to refuse, to laugh in his face and tell him to find someone else. But something in his expression, the vulnerability hidden beneath the hardened exterior, stopped her. "Fine," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. They switched places, and soon Isabel found herself behind the wheel of a car that probably cost more than her entire education. "You've driven before, right?" Gabriel asked, his tone skeptical as he adjusted himself in the passenger seat. "Of course I have!" Isabel snapped, though in truth, she had rarely driven cars as sophisticated as this. As her foot found the gas pedal, the car surged forward faster than she anticipated, and Gabriel reached for the dashboard in alarm. "Easy," he barked, his voice tinged with panic. Isabel's heart raced as she gripped the wheel tighter, easing off the gas. "Sorry," she muttered, trying to calm her nerves. She drove cautiously, the silence between them thick with tension. They arrived at a lavish hotel where Gabriel had arranged to meet his client. Isabel parked the car and exhaled in relief, her hands still trembling from the drive. But as they got out of the car, Gabriel stopped her with a hand on her arm. "You're coming with me," he said firmly. "What? No, I'm not." "Yes, you are. I need you to pretend we're a couple," Gabriel interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It's the only way I can make this deal work." Isabel stared at him, dumbfounded. "You can't be serious." He raised an eyebrow. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Before she could protest further, Gabriel's arm slipped around her waist, pulling her close. The sudden contact sent a jolt through her, and she instinctively tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Just play along," he whispered into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. Isabel stiffened, her heart pounding as they walked into the hotel lobby, his hand resting possessively on her hip. Inside, they were greeted by an elegantly dressed older man who eyed them with suspicion. "Mr. Gabriel, this is your..." The man's gaze lingered on Isabel. Gabriel smiled smoothly. "My fiancée, Isabel. She's here to support me." Isabel forced a smile, though her mind was racing. What had she gotten herself into? The evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and uncomfortable small talk. Gabriel played the part of the charming life successful businessman, while Isabel nodded along, pretending to be the adoring partner. But as the night wore on, she began to realize that Gabriel wasn't just trying to close a business deal. There was something more at stake here, something personal. By the time they left the hotel, Gabriel had secured the client's approval to purchase a massive piece of land for $5 billion. Isabel felt a strange sense of pride in her small role in the success, despite how strange and chaotic the night had been. As they drove back, Gabriel remained silent, his usual confident demeanor subdued. Isabel glanced over at him, wondering what could be going through his mind. But before she could ask, he spoke. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked, surprised. "For helping me tonight. It wasn't easy." Isabel looked at him for a long moment, trying to understand this enigmatic man who had turned her world upside down in a single day. She wasn't sure what to say, so she simply nodded and turned her attention back to the road, the weight of the night settling over her like a heavy fog. The car ride back from the hotel was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the tense, charged atmosphere that had marked the beginning of the night. Instead, it was heavy with thoughts unspoken, questions left hanging in the air. Isabel stole glances at Gabriel, who stared out the window, lost in his own world. The streetlights illuminated his face in flashes, casting shadows that only deepened the mystery surrounding him. They hadn't exchanged many words since leaving the hotel, but the weight of the events hung between them. Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened that night, something beyond just securing a land deal. "Why did you ask me to help you?" Isabel finally broke the silence, her voice soft yet curious. "You could have brought anyone to that meeting, someone who actually knew you or cared about you." Gabriel turned his head slightly, his gaze still far away, before responding. "I needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who could follow directions without getting too involved." He paused, his voice quiet, almost reflective. "And I knew you wouldn't turn me down after what happened with your scholarship." Isabel felt a flush of anger rise in her chest. "So you blackmailed me into this?" "No," Gabriel replied, his voice sharper now. "You got yourself involved the moment you scratched my car. I just gave you a chance to make it right." His words stung, but Isabel knew there was some truth to them. Still, she wasn't about to let him off that easily. "And the handcuffs? What was that really about?" Gabriel's expression flickered, just for a moment. "Like I said, an ex. It's complicated." Isabel snorted softly. "Complicated? You're carrying around handcuffs from an ex. That's more than complicated. It's bizarre." Gabriel didn't respond right away, and for a moment, Isabel thought she had crossed a line. But then he let out a small, humorless laugh. "Maybe I'm bizarre, he muttered under his breath, though she wasn't sure if he meant for her to hear it. The tension between them didn't ease, but it changed. Isabel found herself growing curious about this man who seemed so different from anyone she had ever known. Beneath his cold exterior, there was a depth she hadn't expected and a sadness she couldn't quite place. As they neared Isabel's apartment, Gabriel spoke again, his tone more businesslike this time. "You played your part well tonight. The client was convinced. I'll have the paperwork signed by next week." Isabel nodded, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to praise from someone like Gabriel, and she wasn't sure how much of it was genuine. She wanted to ask him more, about the deal, about the client, even about his ex. But the questions died on her lips when the car slowed to a stop in front of her building. "This is you," Gabriel said, his voice devoid of the warmth that had briefly appeared earlier. "Thanks again." Isabel opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, hesitating for a moment before shutting it behind her. As she walked toward her apartment building, she glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see Gabriel watching her leave. But his car had already pulled away, disappearing into the night. Isabel stood there for a moment, staring at the empty street, feeling the weight of the evening settle over her. What had started as an impulsive act of revenge had spiraled into something much bigger, something she couldn't quite understand yet. She had been pulled into Gabriel's world, and part of her knew that this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. The following week passed in a blur of routine for Isabel. She returned to her part-time job at a local cafe, trying to push thoughts of Gabriel out of her mind. But it was impossible. The night they had spent together lingered in the back of her thoughts like an unfinished sentence. She found herself replaying their conversations, the look in his eyes, the way his hand had gripped her waist in the hotel lobby. It unsettled her in a way she didn't want to admit. Then, one afternoon, while she was wiping down tables at the cafe, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the message. "We need to talk. Meet me at the same place as last time, Gabriel." Isabel's fingers tightened around her phone as she stared at the screen, her mind racing. She hadn't expected to hear from him again so soon, and she certainly hadn't expected such a cryptic message. What could he possibly want now? Her first instinct was to ignore it, to let Gabriel deal with his problems on his own. But she knew that wasn't an option. She had gotten involved, and like it or not, there was no going back now. Later that evening, Isabel found herself standing outside the same hotel where they had met the client. Her stomach twisted with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. She hadn't told anyone about her strange encounter with Gabriel, and now she was about to step back into that world once more. She spotted him immediately, sitting in the hotel bar, his back to the entrance. He looked different tonight, more relaxed, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, his tie loosened. Isabel hesitated before walking over, unsure of what to expect. "Gabriel," she said softly as she approached the table. He looked up, his expression unreadable as always. But there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A weariness, perhaps, or something darker. "You came," he said, motioning for her to sit. Isabel slid into the seat opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What's this about?" Gabriel took a slow sip of his drink before speaking. "I wanted to thank you again for the other night. The deal went through, but there's something else." Isabel's heart raced as she waited for him to continue. But when he finally spoke, his words were not at all what she expected. "I have cancer." The air seemed to freeze between them, the weight of his confession hitting her like a tidal wave. Isabel stared at him, her mind reeling. Of all the things he could have said, this was the last thing she had imagined. What?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. Gabriel looked at her, his expression stoic but his eyes betraying a hint of vulnerability. "It's late stage. I've known for a while, but I didn't think it mattered. Until now." Isabel swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Why are you telling me this?" He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart pound. "Because I don't have much time left, and I need someone I can trust. I don't want to go through this alone." The words hung between them, heavier than anything Isabel had ever heard before. Gabriel, a man she barely knew, was telling her that he had cancer, and that he didn't want to face it alone. The world felt like it was spinning off its axis, and Isabel couldn't find her footing. What was she supposed to say to that? For a long moment, she just stared at him, her mind racing. Her first instinct was to run, to get as far away from this as possible. But the look in Gabriel's eyes, the vulnerability he had shown in that brief confession, stopped her. "I don't understand," Isabel finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why me?" Gabriel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as if the weight of the world were pressing down on him. "Because you're the only person who doesn't have expectations of me. You don't know me well enough to pity me, and I don't have to pretend around you. I just need someone who won't treat me like a ticking time bomb." Isabel shook her head, trying to wrap her mind around what he was asking. "You barely know me, Gabriel. How can you trust me with something like this?" He gave her a small, bitter smile. "I don't know if I can trust you, but you're here, and that's more than I can say for anyone else in my life right now." His words stung, though Isabel wasn't sure why. Part of her wanted to reject him, to walk away from the complexity of it all. But the other part of her, the part that had seen the cracks in his armor, the loneliness in his eyes, couldn't turn away. There was something about Gabriel that pulled her in, something beyond the cold businessman she had first met. "I'm not sure what you want from me," Isabel said carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know how to help you." Gabriel was silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to the glass in his hand. "I don't know either," he admitted quietly. "I just don't want to be alone." The vulnerability in his voice tugged at something deep inside Isabel, and before she could stop herself, she found herself speaking. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll stay. I don't know what this means or what you expect, but I'll stay." Gabriel looked up at her, his expression unreadable, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked almost human. There was a moment of quiet understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that whatever this was, they would figure it out together. The next few weeks passed in a strange blur. Isabel's life seemed to be divided between her normal, mundane routines and the surreal world she found herself in with Gabriel. She continued working at the cafe, but every day after her shift, she would meet Gabriel, sometimes at the hotel, other times at his office. They rarely talked about his illness, but the weight of it was always there, lingering in the background like a shadow they couldn't escape. Despite the odd circumstances that had brought them together, Isabel found herself growing closer to Gabriel in ways she hadn't expected. He was still the same cold, calculating man she had first met, but now there were moments of softness, glimpses of the person beneath the carefully constructed exterior. He never spoke about his past, but Isabel could tell that it weighed on him, the regret and loneliness etched into every line of his face. One evening, as they sat in Gabriel's office overlooking the city skyline, he finally opened up about his diagnosis. "They told me it's terminal," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "There's nothing they can do except buy me time. A few months, maybe." Isabel's heart sank, but she didn't know what to say. What could she say to someone who had just been handed a death sentence? "How do you feel about that?" she asked hesitantly. Gabriel shrugged, his eyes distant. "I don't know. Angry, I guess, but mostly, I feel like I'm running out of time and I've wasted so much of it." Isabel frowned, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Wasted? How?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've spent my whole life chasing power, success, money. I thought those things would make me happy, that they would give me control over my life. But now I realize none of it matters. I've got billions in the bank, and it won't save me. I've pushed everyone away, and now I'm alone." Isabel felt a lump form in her throat. She had always known Gabriel was driven, but she had never realized the extent of the loneliness that came with it. She thought about her own life, how she had struggled to survive, to chase her dreams, but she had never been alone. Even in her darkest moments, she had always had someone to lean on, even if it was just a fleeting friendship or a moment of kindness from a stranger. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't know." Gabriel gave her a small, sad smile. "It's not your fault. I made my choices, and now I have to live with them." They sat in silence for a while, the city lights twinkling outside the window. Isabel didn't know what to say, but she didn't need to. Sometimes, silence was enough. Over time, Gabriel began to let Isabel into his world. He took her to his properties, showed her the deals he was working on, and even introduced her to some of his closest colleagues. Isabel felt out of place in this new world, but Gabriel always made sure she was by his side. It was as if he was trying to make up for all the lost time, trying to create a connection that neither of them fully understood. One day, Gabriel asked Isabel to come with him to visit a piece of land he had just purchased, a sprawling estate overlooking the ocean. They drove out to the coast, the salty breeze whipping through the air as they stood on the cliffside, gazing out at the endless horizon. "This is the last big project I'll be working on," Gabriel said, his voice steady but laced with something Isabel couldn't quite place. "I'm turning it into a retreat, a place where people can come to escape the world, to find peace." Isabel looked at him, surprised. "That sounds beautiful, but why?" Gabriel's eyes softened as he stared out at the ocean. "Because I've spent my whole life building things that don't matter. This will matter. It will be something good, something lasting." Isabel felt a strange sense of admiration for him in that moment. Despite everything, despite the cold exterior and the ruthless businessman she had known, Gabriel was trying to leave something behind, something meaningful. As they stood there, side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Isabel realized that their lives had become intertwined in ways neither of them had expected. What had started as a simple business arrangement had turned into something far more complicated, something deeper. And for the first time in a long while, Isabel felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The sea breeze swirled around them as they stood on the cliffside, staring out at the horizon. Isabel watched Gabriel closely, feeling a shift in the atmosphere between them. He was no longer just the ruthless businessman she had once despised. He had become someone entirely different, someone she was beginning to understand, maybe even care for. As the days passed, their relationship deepened in ways Isabel hadn't anticipated. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet. But there was something intimate about the quiet moments they shared, the unspoken bond that had formed between them in the shadow of his terminal diagnosis. Gabriel let her into his world, and in return, Isabel found herself letting her guard down too. But even as they grew closer, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that Gabriel was keeping something from her. It wasn't just the cancer, though that alone was a monumental burden. No, there was something else, something he hadn't told her yet. One evening, as they sat in his penthouse, sharing a quiet meal, Isabel decided to confront him. "You're hiding something from me," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Gabriel looked up from his plate, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What makes you say that?" Isabel took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "You've been open with me about a lot of things, but I can feel it, Gabriel. There's something you haven't told me." For a moment, he said nothing, simply staring at her with that impenetrable gaze she had come to know so well. Then, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "You're perceptive," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before you figured it out." Isabel's heart raced. She hadn't expected him to admit it so easily. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. Gabriel exhaled slowly, his expression darkening. "It's about my family." Isabel frowned. Gabriel had never mentioned his family before, and she realized she knew very little about his past. "What about them?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as if he were remembering something painful. "I have a daughter," he said finally, his voice low. The words hit Isabel like a punch to the gut. A daughter? Gabriel had a daughter? How had he never mentioned this before? "A daughter?" she repeated, her mind struggling to catch up. "Where is she?" "She lives with her mother," Gabriel said, his voice growing colder. "I haven't seen her in years. We're estranged." Isabel felt a pang of sympathy for him, but also confusion. "Why haven't you seen her? What happened?" Gabriel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Isabel thought he wouldn't answer. But then he spoke, his voice filled with a bitterness she hadn't heard from him before. "I wasn't a good father," he admitted. "I was too focused on my career, on making money. I pushed them both away. My wife left me, took our daughter, and I didn't fight for them. I let them go." Isabel's heart ached for him. She couldn't imagine the pain of losing a child, of knowing you had been the cause of that distance. Have you tried to reach out to her? To make amends? Gabriel shook his head, his gaze hardening. What's the point? It's too late for that. She's better off without me. Isabel didn't know what to say. The regret in his voice was palpable, but so was the wall he had built around himself. He had resigned himself to a life of loneliness, and Isabel could see that he truly believed there was no going back. But something in her refused to accept that. It's never too late, she said quietly. You still have time, Gabriel. You could try to make things right. Gabriel scoffed, though there was no humor in it. And what? Tell her I'm dying? That I want to make up for lost time before I'm gone? It's not that simple. It doesn't have to be about you dying, Isabel insisted, leaning forward. It can be about you wanting to be in her life, even if it's just for a little while. You could give her the chance to know her father, to understand you. Gabriel stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. You don't understand, he said quietly. It's more complicated than that. Isabel frowned, confused. What do you mean? Gabriel hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to continue. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. My daughter doesn't know I'm her father. Isabel froze, her heart skipping a beat. What? She whispered, her mind racing. Gabriel's face was etched with pain as he explained. When my wife left, she cut me out completely. She told our daughter that her real father was someone else, someone better than me. She grew up believing that lie, and I didn't do anything to change it. I let her believe I didn't exist. Isabel was speechless. She couldn't fathom the level of pain Gabriel must have felt, watching his daughter grow up from afar, unable to claim her as his own. Why didn't you tell her the truth? She asked, her voice shaking. Because I didn't deserve to be her father, Gabriel said bitterly. I wasn't there for her. I didn't earn the right to be in her life. Isabel shook her head, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. That's not true. You're her father, Gabriel, whether you think you deserve it or not. You have a right to be in her life. Gabriel looked at her, his expression filled with anguish. What good would it do now? She's grown up without me. She doesn't need me. But you need her, Isabel said softly, her heart breaking for him. Don't you? Gabriel's eyes flickered with something Isabel couldn't quite identify. Regret, hope, maybe even fear. For the first time since she had known him, he looked truly vulnerable. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I need anymore. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Gabriel's confession hanging in the air between them. Isabel didn't know what to say. She had never expected this, had never imagined that beneath Gabriel's cold, hardened exterior lay a man who had lost everything, his family, his chance at redemption. She wanted to help him, to somehow make it right. But she knew that wasn't her decision to make. Gabriel had to be the one to take that step, to reach out to his daughter and try to make amends. And whether or not he did, Isabel knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to leave him to face this alone. I'm here for you, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Whatever you decide, I'll be here. Gabriel didn't respond right away, but the look in his eyes said everything. For the first time, Isabel felt like they were truly connected, two broken souls trying to find their way in a world that had given them more pain than they deserved. And in that moment, Isabel realized that she wasn't just helping Gabriel. She was helping herself too. The following days were marked by a strange quiet between Gabriel and Isabel. Their conversations had grown deeper, more personal, yet there was always an undercurrent of unspoken words, especially after Gabriel's confession about his daughter. Isabel couldn't shake the thought of the young girl, living her life without ever knowing her real father, and how much that must weigh on Gabriel. They spent more time together, and with each passing day, Isabel saw a different side of him, a softer, more reflective side. He wasn't the ruthless businessman she had once believed him to be. He was a man haunted by his past, burdened by regrets, and now facing the end of his life with no one by his side but her. One evening, as they sat in Gabriel's penthouse, sipping wine and watching the city lights flicker below, Isabel finally spoke up about the one thing that had been bothering her since their last conversation. Have you thought about reaching out to your daughter? she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the twinkling skyline. Gabriel didn't respond immediately. He swirled the wine in his glass, his expression distant. "I've thought about it," he admitted after a long pause, "but I don't know if it's the right thing to do." Isabel turned to face him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Of course, it's the right thing to do. She deserves to know who her real father is." Gabriel sighed, leaning back against the couch, his eyes heavy with uncertainty. "It's not that simple, Isabel. She's lived her whole life believing another man is her father. If I show up now, telling her the truth, it could turn her world upside down. Or," Isabel countered, "it could give her the chance to know the truth, to understand where she comes from. Maybe it's what she needs." Gabriel's eyes flickered with doubt, but there was something else there too. Hope, maybe. "And what if she hates me for it? What if she resents me for staying away all these years?" Isabel shook her head, her voice gentle but firm. "You won't know unless you try. And even if it's hard, even if she's angry, at least she'll know the truth. She deserves that much, don't you think?" Gabriel was silent for a long time, staring into his glass as if searching for answers in the deep red liquid. Isabel watched him, her heart aching for the pain he carried. She could see how much this weighed on him, the constant battle between fear and hope, regret and the desire for redemption. Finally, Gabriel set his glass down on the table and ran a hand through his hair. "You're right," he said quietly. "She deserves to know, but I don't know how to tell her." Isabel smiled softly, placing her hand over his. "You'll figure it out, and I'll be here to help you if you want." Gabriel looked at her then, his eyes searching hers, and for the first time, Isabel saw real gratitude in his gaze. It was a look that made her heart skip a beat, a reminder of how much had changed between them. They had started as strangers, brought together by chance, but now they were something more, something that neither of them had expected. The next week, Gabriel took the first step. He reached out to his daughter's mother, a woman he hadn't spoken to in years. The conversation was tense, filled with old wounds and unspoken grievances, but in the end, she agreed to arrange a meeting between Gabriel and their daughter. Gabriel didn't tell Isabel much about the conversation, but she could see the toll it took on him. He was more withdrawn, quieter than usual, as if the weight of the upcoming meeting was pressing down on him. Isabel tried to be supportive, offering him encouragement and reminding him that he was doing the right thing, but she knew this was something he had to face alone. On the day of the meeting, Gabriel was a bundle of nerves. He paced around his penthouse, checking his phone every few minutes, his usually calm demeanor completely shattered. Isabel watched him, feeling both helpless and hopeful. "You'll be fine," she said softly, standing by the door as he prepared to leave. "Just be honest with her. She'll appreciate that." Gabriel nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "I hope you're right," he murmured, pulling on his jacket. "I don't want to hurt her any more than I already have." Isabel's heart ached for him. She walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "You're doing the right thing, Gabriel. No matter what happens, she deserves to know you tried." Gabriel looked at her, his expression softening. For a moment, he seemed on the verge of saying something more, but then he simply nodded and left, the door closing softly behind him. The hours ticked by slowly after Gabriel left. Isabel couldn't focus on anything, her mind consumed with thoughts of how the meeting was going. She tried reading, then cleaning, but nothing could distract her from the nagging worry in the back of her mind. It wasn't until late in the evening that Gabriel finally returned. Isabel was sitting on the couch, anxiously waiting when she heard the sound of the door opening. She looked up to see Gabriel standing in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes distant. "How did it go?" she asked softly, standing up to meet him. Gabriel didn't respond right away. He walked over to the couch and sank down into the cushions, running a hand over his face. "It was hard," he admitted, his voice rough. She was shocked, of course. She didn't believe me at first, but eventually, she listened. Isabel sat down beside him, her heart racing. "And?" Gabriel exhaled slowly, his hands trembling slightly. She didn't say much. She was angry, hurt even. But in the end, she said she wanted time to think about everything. Isabel placed her hand gently on his, her voice soft with understanding. "That's a good sign, Gabriel," She didn't shut you out completely. She just needs time. Gabriel nodded, though there was still a look of doubt in his eyes. I don't know if she'll ever want me in her life, he said quietly. But at least I told her the truth. At least she knows. Isabel squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with pride for him. You did the right thing. That's what matters. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the evening hanging between them. Then slowly, Gabriel turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. Thank you, he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you. Isabel felt her breath catch in her throat, the intensity of his gaze sending a shiver down her spine. She hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated how deeply she would come to care for him. But in that moment, she knew that whatever this was, whatever they had become to each other, it was real. You're welcome, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Gabriel's hand lingered on hers for a moment longer, and in the quiet of the night, Isabel felt something shift between them. Their fates had become entwined, and there was no turning back now. The tension between Gabriel and Isabel had shifted after his meeting with his daughter. There was an unspoken closeness that hadn't existed before. A bond forged not just in their shared moments, but in the vulnerability Gabriel had shown her. The days that followed were quieter, calmer, but there was always a subtle tension underneath, an energy that neither of them addressed, but both felt deeply. Isabel continued to support Gabriel through the uncertainty of his daughter's response. Though his daughter hadn't fully opened up to him yet, Gabriel seemed lighter, as if the weight of his past was finally beginning to lift. But Isabel knew better than to believe that everything could fix so easily. There were still parts of Gabriel's life that he kept hidden, parts of himself he hadn't let her see yet. One evening, as they sat together in Gabriel's penthouse, Isabel finally gathered the courage to ask him about his past, the parts of his life he had never mentioned. They had talked about his daughter, about his regrets, but there were still shadows that lingered around him, secrets he hadn't revealed. Gabriel, she began softly, her voice hesitant. You've told me a lot about your daughter and your regrets with her, but what about the rest of your life? Before all of this, you've never really talked about your family, your parents. What was your life like growing up? Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he stared out the window at the city below. The lights of the skyline flickered in the reflection of the glass, casting shadows across his face. I don't talk about my family for a reason, he said finally, his voice low. It's not something I like to remember. Isabel's heart ached at the sadness in his tone. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only deepened her concern. What happened? Gabriel's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. But then, with a sigh, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. My father was a hard man, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. He was cold, distant, but powerful. He built his fortune from the ground up, and he expected perfection from everyone around him, especially me. Isabel listened in silence, her heart sinking as Gabriel's story unfolded. I was his only son, and that meant I was the heir to everything. But that also meant I had to live up to his impossible standards. Nothing I did was ever good enough for him. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how successful I became, it was never enough. Gabriel paused, his hands clenching into fists. Isabel could see the pain in his eyes, the scars left by years of emotional neglect. My mother, she was different. He continued, his voice softening. She was kind, gentle, but she was weak. She never stood up to my father. She just let him control everything, let him dictate our lives. I think she was afraid of him, in her own way. Isabel swallowed hard, her chest tightening as she imagined the kind of life Gabriel must have had, trapped between a domineering father and a submissive mother. It was no wonder he had grown into the man he was today, cold, guarded, always in control. I tried to break away, Gabriel said, his voice rough. After my mother died, I tried to get out from under his shadow. I wanted to build something for myself, something that wasn't tied to him. But no matter what I did, it always came back to him. His influence was everywhere. Isabel reached out, placing her hand on his arm. You did break away, she said softly. You built something for yourself. You've accomplished so much. Gabriel shook his head, his lips twisting into a bitter smile. What have I accomplished? Money? Power? None of it matters. Not now. His words cut deep, and Isabel felt a surge of emotion welling up inside her. She had seen the real Gabriel, the man behind the cold exterior, the man who cared deeply, even if he didn't want to admit it. He wasn't just a product of his father's influence. He was so much more. "You're not your father," Isabel said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "You're not like him. You've made mistakes, yes, but you're trying to make things right. That's what matters." Gabriel looked at her, his expression softening for a moment before his gaze dropped to the floor. "Maybe," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "but sometimes I wonder if it's too late for me." Isabel's heart ached at his words. She knew that Gabriel's past had shaped him, but she also knew that he wasn't beyond redemption. He had come so far, and she wasn't going to let him give up now. "It's not too late," she said quietly, her hand still resting on his arm. "You still have time, Gabriel. You can still make things right, with your daughter, with yourself." Gabriel didn't respond immediately, but the look in his eyes told Isabel that her words had struck a chord. He was struggling, she could see that, but he wasn't completely lost. There was still a part of him that wanted to be saved, a part of him that wanted to make amends for the mistakes he had made. The next few days passed in a blur of routine, with Gabriel continuing his work and Isabel staying by his side. They didn't talk much about his family after that night, but Isabel could sense that the conversation had left a mark on him. He was quieter, more introspective, and there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, as they sat in Gabriel's office, he received a phone call that would change everything. "It's her," Gabriel said quietly, his eyes widening as he looked at his phone screen. Isabel's heart raced. His daughter. She had called. Gabriel answered the call, his voice tentative. "Hello?" Isabel watched as his expression shifted from surprise to relief. His daughter had agreed to meet him again, this time on her own terms. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. A small crack in the wall that had kept them apart for so long. After the call ended, Gabriel turned to Isabel, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "She wants to talk again." Isabel smiled, her heart swelling with pride for him. "That's amazing, Gabriel. It's a good sign." Gabriel nodded, though his expression was still cautious. "I don't know what she'll say, but it's a chance." "It's more than that," Isabel said softly. "It's the beginning of something better." As the day of their second meeting approached, Gabriel grew more anxious, but there was also a new sense of determination in him. He was ready to fight for his relationship with his daughter, to make things right in whatever way he could. Isabel stayed by his side, offering support and encouragement, knowing how important this moment was for him. The morning of the meeting, Gabriel stood by the window of his penthouse, staring out at the city below. Isabel walked over to him, sensing the weight of his thoughts. "You're going to be okay," she said softly, her hand resting on his shoulder. Gabriel turned to her, his expression filled with uncertainty. "What if I fail?" "You won't," Isabel said firmly, "because you're trying. That's all that matters." Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, his gaze filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Isabel smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "You're not alone in this, Gabriel. You've got me." For the first time in a long while, Gabriel's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. And in that moment, Isabel knew that whatever the outcome of his meeting with his daughter, Gabriel was already on the path to healing. The morning of Gabriel's second meeting with his daughter arrived with a sense of quiet anticipation. Gabriel had been on edge for days, oscillating between hope and fear. Isabel had done her best to reassure him, reminding him that the mere fact his daughter wanted to see him again was a positive step, but even she knew that things could still fall apart. As Gabriel prepared to leave for the meeting, Isabel could feel the tension radiating off him. His usual calm, controlled demeanor had cracked, and the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide was on full display. "You've got this," she said, standing beside him as he adjusted his tie. "Just be honest with her. That's all you can do." Gabriel glanced at her, his expression strained but appreciative. "I wish I could believe it's that simple." Isabel stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not going to be easy, but you've already taken the hardest step, reaching out." Now it's up to her, and all you can do is be there. Gabriel exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly as he nodded. I'm scared, Isabel, he admitted quietly, the vulnerability in his voice surprising even himself. What if she can't forgive me? What if she hates me for everything I've done? Isabel's heart ached at his words. She had come to care for Gabriel in ways she hadn't expected. And seeing him like this, stripped of all his defenses, made her want to protect him from the pain he feared so deeply. She won't hate you, Isabel said softly. She might be hurt, confused, even angry, but deep down, she wants to know you. She wouldn't have agreed to meet again if she didn't. Gabriel didn't respond right away, but the tension in his body seemed to ease ever so slightly. After a moment, he straightened his tie and glanced at the door, readying himself to leave. I'll call you when it's over, he said, his voice steadier now. Isabel smiled, nodding. I'll be here. With one last look, Gabriel turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. Isabel stood there for a moment, her heart heavy with anticipation. She knew this meeting was a pivotal moment in Gabriel's life, a chance for him to finally confront the past and begin to heal. She just hoped it would go the way he needed it to. The hours dragged on slowly after Gabriel left. Isabel busied herself around the penthouse, cleaning, organizing, anything to keep her mind off the uncertainty of the day. But no matter what she did, her thoughts kept drifting back to Gabriel and the meeting with his daughter. Would she forgive him? Would she give him a chance to be part of her life? Or would the wounds of the past prove too deep to heal? It wasn't until late afternoon that Isabel's phone buzzed, her heart leaping into her throat as she saw Gabriel's name on the screen. It's done. I'm coming back. The message was brief, giving nothing away, but the fact that he hadn't called was enough to make Isabel's heart sink. She knew Gabriel well enough by now to know that when things got tough, he retreated into himself, locking away his emotions behind a wall of silence. When he finally arrived back at the penthouse, Isabel could see the exhaustion etched into his face. His usually sharp eyes were dull, and his posture was tense, as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. How did it go? Isabel asked softly, walking over to him as he stepped inside. Gabriel dropped his keys on the table and ran a hand through his hair, his expression pained. It was difficult. Isabel's heart clenched. Did she say anything? Did she listen? Gabriel sighed, sinking down onto the couch, his head in his hands. She listened, but it was hard. She was angry, confused. She kept asking why I hadn't been there, why I hadn't fought for her. Isabel sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. And what did you say? Gabriel looked up at her, his eyes filled with guilt. I told her the truth, that I was too selfish, too focused on my own life to be the father she deserved, that I let her mother take her because I thought they were better off without me. Isabel's throat tightened as she listened. She could only imagine how hard it must have been for Gabriel to admit that, to confront his own failings so openly. She cried, Gabriel continued, his voice breaking slightly. She said she hated me for not being there. And honestly, I don't blame her. Isabel squeezed his arm, her heart breaking for him. But she came to see you. That means something, Gabriel. It means she still cares. Gabriel shook his head, his expression filled with doubt. I don't know. She said she needed time to process everything, that she wasn't ready to have me in her life yet. But at least she didn't walk away completely. Isabel felt a flicker of hope in his words, even if Gabriel couldn't see it yet. That's a start. It's more than you had before. Gabriel's gaze softened as he looked at her, his voice quiet. I don't know what I would have done without you, Isabel. You've been there for me through all of this, and I don't deserve it. Isabel smiled sadly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Everyone deserves a chance, Gabriel. Even you. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through settling between them. Isabel could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken emotions that had been building for weeks. And in that quiet, she realized that her feelings for Gabriel had deepened far beyond what she had ever expected. She cared about him, not just as a friend or a confidant, but as something more. But she also knew that Gabriel's world was complicated, filled with shadows and uncertainties, and she wasn't sure if there was room for her in it. As if sensing her thoughts, Gabriel turned to her, his expression softening. I know I've put you through a lot, he said quietly. And I don't expect you to keep staying by my side, but I want you to know I'm grateful, more than I can say. Isabel's heart fluttered, the warmth in his voice sending a wave of emotion through her. She had never expected to find herself so deeply entwined in his life, but now that she was, she couldn't imagine walking away. I'm not going anywhere, Gabriel, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. I told you before, I'm here for you, whatever happens. Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find something he couldn't quite express. And then, slowly, he reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. Isabel's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening at the touch. There was something different about this moment, something charged with an emotion they hadn't yet acknowledged. She could feel the tension between them, the unspoken connection that had been growing stronger with each passing day. And in that moment, Isabel realized that she was no longer just a bystander in Gabriel's life. She was a part of it now, in ways that neither of them had anticipated. Thank you, Gabriel whispered, his voice filled with a sincerity that sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. Isabel smiled, her heart full as she squeezed his hand gently. You don't have to thank me, Gabriel. We're in this together. Gabriel's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, Isabel saw a glimmer of hope in his gaze. A hope that maybe, just maybe, they could both find the peace they had been searching for. The days after Gabriel's second meeting with his daughter passed with a sense of cautious hope. Though she hadn't fully forgiven him yet, the fact that she was willing to meet again left a small crack in the wall that had separated them for so long. Gabriel, despite his usual stoicism, seemed lighter, as though a burden had been partially lifted. But Isabel knew better than to think that everything was resolved. Healing takes time, and forgiveness even more so. Isabel and Gabriel continued their quiet routine, work during the day, and evenings spent together in the penthouse or exploring the city. It was in these ordinary moments, away from the weight of Gabriel's illness and his strained relationship with his daughter, that Isabel realized how much she had come to care for him. She had never expected this, a deep connection, a growing affection for a man she had once despised. But with that affection came uncertainty. Gabriel's life was still fragile, balanced between his terminal diagnosis and the fractured relationships in his past. Isabel couldn't help but wonder where she fit into all of it, or if there was even a future for them beyond this tenuous moment of calm. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop of the penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle below, Isabel finally decided to voice the question that had been gnawing at her for days. Gabriel, she began softly, her gaze fixed on the skyline. What happens next? With us? Gabriel turned to her, his expression thoughtful, but a flicker of uncertainty passed through his eyes. What do you mean? Isabel hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. I mean, where do we go from here? We've been spending all this time together, and I feel like something is happening between us. But I don't know what it means, or if it means anything at all. Gabriel was silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to his hands. Isabel could see the tension in his posture, the way he seemed to be grappling with something he wasn't ready to confront. I don't know, he admitted finally, his voice quiet. I didn't expect any of this. You've been there for me in ways I didn't think anyone would. But my life, it's complicated, Isabel. I don't want to drag you into it any more than I already have. Isabel's chest tightened. She had anticipated this answer, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. I'm already in it, Gabriel, she said softly. I've been here with you through everything. Your daughter, your illness. I care about you, more than I ever thought I would. Gabriel's eyes softened, but there was still a shadow of doubt in them. I care about you too, Isabel. But I'm dying. I don't want to put you through that. I don't want you to watch me get worse. Isabel's heart ached at his words. She knew he was trying to protect her, to shield her from the pain that was inevitably coming. But she also knew that running away from it wouldn't change anything. I'm not afraid of that, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. I know what's coming, Gabriel, but I'd rather be here with you, for however long we have, than walk away now and regret it for the rest of my life. Gabriel looked at her, his expression filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "You don't deserve this, Isabel. You deserve someone who can give you a future, not a man who's running out of time." Isabel shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't care about that. I care about you. And if all we have is now, then I want to be here, with you." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of Isabel's words hanging between them. Gabriel's gaze softened, and slowly he reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Isabel squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with love and sadness all at once. "Maybe you don't, but I'm here anyway." Gabriel's grip tightened around her hand, and in that moment, Isabel knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. She had chosen him, and he, despite his doubts, had chosen her too. In the days that followed, Gabriel grew more introspective. His meetings with his daughter continued, and though progress was slow, there was a sense that they were finally beginning to rebuild what had been broken for so long. Isabel was there every step of the way, offering him quiet support, never pushing, but always present when he needed her. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of fear that neither of them spoke about, the looming reality of Gabriel's illness. Though he rarely mentioned it, Isabel could see the toll it was taking on him. His energy was waning, and there were days when the pain was too much for him to hide. Still, he refused to let it control him, and Isabel admired his strength, even as it broke her heart to see him struggle. One evening, as they sat together in the penthouse, Gabriel finally addressed the topic they had both been avoiding. "I've been thinking about my treatment," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with something Isabel couldn't quite place. Isabel looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What about it?" Gabriel sighed, leaning back against the couch. "The doctors want me to try another round of chemotherapy, but I don't know if I want to do it." Isabel's breath caught in her throat. She had known this conversation was coming, but hearing Gabriel say the words out loud made it all the more real. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I'm thinking, maybe it's time to let go. The treatment isn't going to save me. It'll just prolong the inevitable. And I don't want to spend whatever time I have left being sick and miserable." Isabel's chest tightened, her heart breaking at the thought of losing him sooner than she had expected. But at the same time, she understood. Gabriel had fought so hard for so long, and if he was ready to stop, she couldn't blame him. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's your choice, Gabriel, and whatever you decide, I'll be here. I'll support you." Gabriel looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Isabel leaned closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You don't have to go through this alone." For a long moment, they sat together in silence, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Isabel knew that Gabriel was facing the hardest choice of his life, and no matter what he chose, the road ahead would be difficult. But she also knew that they would face it together, no matter what. As the night wore on, Gabriel finally spoke again, his voice soft but resolute. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life in a hospital. I want to spend it with you." Isabel's heart swelled with emotion, tears welling in her eyes as she looked at him. "Then that's what we'll do," she said quietly. "We'll make the most of every moment we have, together." Gabriel nodded, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. "Together," he echoed, his voice filled with quiet determination. In that moment, Isabel knew that whatever time they had left, whether it was weeks, months, or longer, they would face it side by side. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they would walk it together, hand in the face of truth. The decision Gabriel had made to stop treatment and live the remainder of his days on his own terms marked a turning point. From that moment on, the dynamic between him and Isabel shifted. The weight of his illness no longer loomed over every conversation, and instead of focusing on what was to come, they poured all their energy into making the most of the present. They spent their days doing simple things, walking along the beach, visiting art galleries, and sharing quiet moments in the penthouse. Time felt precious in a way it never had before, and every moment together seemed imbued with a sense of urgency, of gratitude for the life they still had. Isabel had expected to feel fear, to be overwhelmed by the knowledge that Gabriel's time was limited. But instead, she found herself cherishing every second. She watched as Gabriel opened up in ways she hadn't thought possible, laughing more, sharing stories from his past, even teasing her about the little quirks he had come to know. It was as if, in accepting the inevitable, Gabriel had finally let go of the walls he had spent so long building. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop under a blanket of stars, Gabriel turned to Isabel with an expression she hadn't seen before, a mix of contentment and something deeper, something she hadn't dared to hope for. "I've been thinking," he said softly, his voice carrying over the quiet night air, "about what comes after." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Gabriel hesitated, glancing down at the glass of wine in his hand. "I mean, I've spent my whole life thinking about what happens after I'm gone. My legacy, my money, my businesses. I thought that was all that mattered. But now," he paused, looking up at her, his eyes softening. "Now I realize none of that is important. What's important is this: being here with you." Isabel's chest tightened at his words, her eyes filling with unshed tears. She had never heard Gabriel speak so openly, so vulnerably. It was as if he had finally shed the last of the armor he had worn for so long, leaving only the man she had come to love. "I don't want to leave this world without knowing that I made the right choices in the end," Gabriel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "And the only right choice I've made lately is you." Isabel's heart swelled, her throat tightening as she fought to hold back tears. "Gabriel," she whispered, her voice trembling. He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I don't have much time left. We both know that. But I want to spend whatever time I have left with you, not just as someone who's here to help me through this, but as the person I want to be with, truly." Isabel's breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. She had known, deep down, that their connection had grown into something profound, but hearing him say it, hearing him admit that he wanted to be with her, even now, even in the face of his illness, was overwhelming. "I love you, Isabel," Gabriel said quietly, his voice filled with a raw vulnerability that sent a shiver down her spine. "I didn't think I'd ever say that to anyone again, but I love you. And I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure you know that." Tears welled in Isabel's eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she looked at him, her heart overflowing with emotion. She had never expected to find love in the midst of so much chaos, so much pain. But here it was, undeniable and real. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't think I would feel this way, but I do. I love you, Gabriel, and I want to be with you, no matter what happens." Gabriel's eyes softened as he leaned closer, his hand gently brushing away the tears on her cheeks. "Then let's make the most of what we have," he whispered. "Let's not waste another second." In that moment, Isabel felt a sense of peace wash over her, as if all the uncertainty and fear had melted away, leaving only the two of them, wrapped in the warmth of their love. She leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a soft, tender kiss, the world around them fading as they lost themselves in the moment. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Isabel had ever known. She and Gabriel continued to build their life together, cherishing every moment as though it were their last. They traveled to places Gabriel had always wanted to see, from the vineyards of Tuscany to the quiet, misty hills of Scotland. Each experience felt like a gift, a chance to create memories that would live on long after Gabriel was gone. But even as they embraced the joy of the present, the reality of Gabriel's illness was never far from their minds. His health continued to decline, and though he tried to hide the pain from Isabel, she could see the toll it was taking on him. There were days when he could barely get out of bed, when the weight of his illness pressed down on him with a force that was impossible to ignore. On those days, Isabel stayed by his side, holding his hand, offering comfort in the only way she knew how. She never left him, never let him face the darkness alone. And through it all, their love only deepened, becoming a source of strength for both of them. One evening, as they sat together in the penthouse, Gabriel's voice broke the quiet. "I've been thinking about the future," he said softly, his eyes tired but filled with a quiet determination. Isabel frowned, her heart tightening at his words. "What about it?" Gabriel hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I want to make sure you're taken care of. After I'm gone. Isabel's chest tightened at the thought of a world without Gabriel, but she pushed the fear aside, focusing on him. Gabriel. I know, he said quietly, cutting her off. I know you don't want to talk about it, but we need to. I've made arrangements. My will, the estate. I want you to have everything. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. Gabriel, I don't need any of that. I don't care about the money or the estate. I just want you. Gabriel smiled sadly, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. I know, but I want to make sure you're okay. I need to know that when I'm gone, you'll be taken care of. Isabel's heart ached at his words, the weight of his love for her settling over her like a warm blanket. She didn't care about the material things, but she understood that for Gabriel, this was his way of showing her how much he cared, of ensuring that his love for her would continue, even after he was gone. I don't want to think about losing you, Isabel whispered, her voice blinking. Gabriel's eyes softened as he reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. You won't lose me, Isabel. Not really. I'll always be with you, in everything we've shared, in everything we've built together. That's what matters. Tears filled Isabel's eyes as she looked at him, her heart breaking and swelling with love all at once. I love you, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. I love you too, Gabriel replied, his voice soft but filled with the depth of a love that had changed both their lives. In that moment, Isabel knew that no matter what happened, their love would endure. It would live on in the memories they had created, in the quiet moments they had shared, and in the knowledge that they had found each other when they needed it most. And though their time together was limited, their love was eternal. The end. Let me know if you'd like any changes or adjustments to the story.